Alien energy scans detected the legendary Doomsday weapon lurking deep within the shattered human ruins. Brian Stonewall Brown clenched his teeth, staring at his sensor display. No human had seen the Apocalypse device in 500 years, not since the fall of Earth. The weapon that was humankind's last vengeful act before the homeworld burned. The weapon that the aliens feared more than anything else in the galaxy. Now Brian and his crew of explorers had stumbled upon it, ancient and waiting, on this barren rock at the arse end of the Orion Nebula. And the Orion patrol ship had detected it too. The door slid open with a hydraulic hiss, revealing the cracked obsidian landscape stretching to the horizon. Gnarled metal spires jutted from the blasted earth, remnants of humanity's once mighty presence on this world, now nothing but corroded bones. The only intact structure was the squat black obelisk 3 clicks to the north, the source of the unusual energy signature, the location of the Doomsday weapon. Ryland Choi flank left, Sorensen Ivanov flank right, I'll take point. Brian stepped out onto the onyx sand, the crunch of his combat boots loud in the still air. If that Orion son of a bitch Boron wants the weapon, he'll have to pry it from my cold dead hands. Brian set off at a jog, the others falling into formation behind him. They had to reach the obelisk and secure the weapon before the Orions landed. This was the discovery of the century, proof that humans had been a spacefaring power long before the Orion Empire. Technology that could tilt the balance of power back in favor of humanity's scattered and downtrodden descendants. But if the Orions got the weapon first, it would spell the end of the human race once and for all. Brian gritted his teeth and ran faster. Failure was not an option. The obelisk loomed above them, its sleek black surface pockmarked from centuries of neglect. Brian led the charge up the cracked onyx steps, heart pounding. They shoved through the doorway, rifles ready. Inside was a cavernous chamber filled with rows of dormant computer banks. Ryland ran his flashlight over the consoles. Holy shit, these are quantum mainframes from the 22nd century. The processing power in here could run a small planet. Brian nodded. Download everything you can, weapons, shields, engines, the whole damn database. We'll sort it out back on Earth. Choi jacked a data drive into the central terminal, and her fingers flew across the keys. Encrypting and compressing now. 2 minutes to transmission. A concussive boom shook the foundations of the obelisk. Dust rained from the high ceiling. Brian checked his rifle's charge. Looks like Boron's here to crash the party. Defensive positions. The crew spread out, taking cover behind the thick metal struts supporting the roof. Brian crouched by the door, listening, the clank of boots on stone, the hiss-snap of a plasma rifle being armed. He held up 3 fingers. 2, 1. The door blasted inward, smoke pouring through the gap. Boron stormed in, flanked by 2 hulking Orion shock troopers. Brian squeezed the trigger, the recoil slamming his shoulder. The plasma bolt caught the first trooper in the chest, burning clean through his armor. He dropped with a gurgle. Boron roared and charged, swinging the stock of his rifle at Brian's head. Brian ducked and rolled, coming up in a crouch. He fired from the hip, forcing Boron to dive behind a bank of computers for cover. All around them, plasma bolts crisscrossed the chamber as the 2 teams traded shots. Alarms blared and sparks cascaded from severed wires. The obelisk shook, the ancient metal groaning in protest. 30 seconds! Choi yelled over the chaos. Brian vaulted a console and sprinted for the back of the room, drawing Boron away from the data transmission. The Orion commander took the bait, hot on Brian's heels. They clashed in a tangle of limbs, rifles forgotten. Boron raked his claws across Brian's face, drawing blood. Brian drove a knee into the alien's gut and threw an elbow at his throat. Boron staggered back, choking. A shout from Sorensen. Data away, let's get the hell out of here. Brian risked a glance at his crew. Ryland was down, clutching a scorched hole in his thigh. Ivanov hauled him up, slinging an arm over her shoulders. They limped for the exit, as Choi and Sorensen laid down covering fire. Boron lunged, slamming into Brian and sending them both tumbling down a jagged ramp into the obelisk's sub-levels. They crashed through a partially collapsed doorway into a darkened corridor. Boron lashed out, his claws ripping into Brian's calf. Gritting his teeth against the pain, Brian kicked the alien away and staggered to his feet. Klaxons echoed through the cramped hallway, and red emergency lights flashed along the walls. The floor lurched beneath them. The obelisk was coming apart, the last of its ancient systems failing after millennia of disuse. Brian turned to run, but Boron's vice-like grip closed around his ankle, yanking him off balance. As he fell, Brian glimpsed Sorensen silhouetted in the far doorway, gesturing frantically. "Brian, we have to go. The shuttle's taking off." Brian's head slammed into the decking, stars exploding across his vision. He shook them away and kicked out blindly, his boot connecting with Boron's face with a satisfying crunch. The Orion's grip loosened, and Brian scrambled free. He pelted down the corridor, breath ragged and leg bleeding freely. He stumbled up the ramp and into the main chamber. It was empty, his crew nowhere to be seen. A deep rumble built beneath his feet. The obelisk was seconds from collapse. Brian pushed himself faster, ignoring the white-hot agony in his calf. He burst from the entrance just as a geyser of fire erupted behind him. The shockwave lifted him off his feet and sent him tumbling across the onyx sand. He rolled to a stop, coughing out dust and blood. The obelisk belched black smoke and flames, the metal skeleton groaning as it folded in on itself like a dying star. Brian watched it crumple, chest heaving. A small measure of satisfaction kindled in his heart. Even if he died here, at least those Orion bastards wouldn't get their slimy claws on the weapon. A familiar whine filled the air, and Brian looked up to see the shuttlecraft angling down towards him, maneuvering jets flaring. It wobbled and listed drunkenly, the hull peppered with scorch marks and jagged tears. One of the engine pods was a blackened ruin, belching smoke. Boron's parting gift. The shuttle settled to the ground a dozen meters away, the damaged landing gear crumpling on impact. The hatch slid open, and Choi leaned out, waving frantically. Brian dragged himself up and limped towards the shuttle, his mangled leg barely able to support his weight. He was steps away from the hatch when a plasma bolt sizzled past his ear, close enough to singe his hair. Boron emerged from the billowing smoke, face contorted with rage and hate. Purple blood leaked from his broken nose, splattering the sand. He leveled his rifle at Brian's chest, finger tightening on the trigger. He threw himself to the side as Boron fired, the plasma bolt scorching the air where he'd been standing a heartbeat before. Brian brought up his own rifle and pulled the trigger. Click. The charge was empty. Boron stalked forward, lips peeled back from razor teeth in a vicious grin. He kicked the rifle from Brian's hands contemptuously. "I will mount your skull in my trophy room, the last human fool to defy the might of the Orion Empire." "Get in line," Brian spat. "You're not the first Xeno bastard to underestimate us. You won't be the last." Boron snarled and raised his rifle, aiming point-blank at Brian's face. Brian tensed, ready to make one final lunge, one last act of defiance. Sorensen stood in the shuttle's hatch, pistol raised. "Eat shit, lizard boy." He fired again and again, the heavy round slamming into Boron's chest, driving him back. The Orion fell to his knees, blood bubbling from his lipless mouth. Brian pushed himself up and stepped forward, scooping up Boron's fallen rifle. He pressed the barrel to the alien's head, right between his hate-filled eyes. He pulled the trigger and Boron slumped to the sand, a smoking crater where his face used to be. Brian let the rifle drop from numb fingers and staggered to the shuttle. Sorensen and Choi caught him as he stumbled inside, easing him down onto a makeshift bunk. "Strap in, people, this is going to be a rough ride," Sorensen barked as he sealed the hatch. The shuttle lurched and clawed for the sky, the struts groaning with the strain. Brian lay back, exhaustion settling over him like a leaden blanket. His eyes slid shut as the shuttle broke atmosphere, the last remnants of humanity's legacy secure in the computer banks. They were bloodied and battered but unbroken. The siege dragged on, each day bleeding into the next as Brian and his battered team fought to hold their ground against the relentless Orion onslaught. They scoured the ancient ruins, desperate for anything that could give them an edge against their technologically superior foe. It was Choi who found it, nestled in a hidden chamber deep beneath the obelisk's foundations. A stasis pod, its metal surface burnished with age but still intact. She called out to the others, her voice echoing through the darkened corridors. Brian limped over, his wounded leg throbbing with each step. He studied the pod, hope warring with trepidation in his gut. Stasis technology was notoriously finicky, and there was no telling what condition the occupant might be in after centuries of isolation. Sorensen and Ivanov worked to disengage the locks, the mechanisms groaning in protest. The pod hissed open, frigid air billowing out in a cloud of condensation. A figure lay inside, clad in the tattered remains of a pressure suit. Brian leaned closer, his breath catching in his throat. The figure's eyes snapped open, hard and alert. He surged upright, hands coming up in a defensive posture. Brian scrambled back, instinctively bringing his rifle to bear. "Whoa, easy there," Sorensen said, stepping between them. "We're all human here." The man blinked, confusion giving way to recognition as he took in their faces. "What year is it?" His voice was gravelly with disuse. 2697, Brian said. "You've been out for a long time." The man nodded slowly. "Captain Marcus Reeve, UNSC Juggernaut Corps." He pushed himself out of the pod, servos whining in his suit. "Where's the rest of my crew?" Brian exchanged a glance with Choi. "I'm sorry, Captain, you're the only one we found." "Crawling all over this rock like roaches," Ivanov spat. "We're the last humans standing between them and a cache of ancient weapons tech." Reeves' eyes narrowed. "Then it sounds like I arrived just in time." He turned to Brian. "Sit rep, soldier. What are we working with here?" Brian quickly brought the captain up to speed on their situation, the doomsday weapon, the Orion siege, and the damaged shuttle. Reeve listened intently, his expression hardening with each new revelation. "All right," he said when Brian had finished. "We need to even the odds. These ruins were once a Juggernaut outpost. If we can get to the command center, I might be able to reactivate the defense systems." "That's a hell of a long shot," Sorensen said. "Those systems have been dead for centuries." Reeve shot him a grim smile. "Son, I helped design those systems. If anyone can get them back online, it's me." Brian nodded. "It's worth a try. Ivanov, Choi, go with the captain. Sorensen and I will hold the line here." They split up, Reeve leading his team deeper into the ruins, while Brian and Sorensen took up positions near the entrance. They didn't have to wait long before the Orions renewed their assault, plasma fire sizzling through the air. Brian ducked behind a shattered column, popping out to squeeze off a few shots before diving back into cover. Beside him, Sorensen lobbed a plasma grenade, the resulting explosion sending chunks of stone and Orion flesh spattering across the chamber. "I'm running low on ammo," Sorensen panted, slamming a fresh charge into his rifle. Brian checked his own weapon, grimacing at the readout. "Make every shot count, we just need to buy Reeve more time." As if summoned by his words, a hologram of Commander Boron flickered to life in the center of the room. The Orion glared at them, his reptilian features twisted with disdain. "Your resistance is futile, humans," he hissed. "Surrender now, and I may grant you a swift death." Brian stepped out from behind the column, meeting Boron's gaze unflinchingly. "How about you just fuck off back to whatever slimy shithole you crawled out of?" Boron snarled. "Bold words from a primate on the brink of extinction. I will take great pleasure in grinding your species beneath my heel." "Gotta catch us first, asshole." "Ah, but I already have." Boron's lips peeled back in a predatory grin. "My troops are scouring these ruins as we speak. It's only a matter of time before they find whatever it is you're trying to protect." Brian's heart skipped a beat, but he kept his expression carefully neutral. "Good luck with that." Boron chuckled darkly. "I don't need luck, human. I have the finest warriors in the galaxy under my command. Warriors who would relish the chance to test their mettle against an inferior specimen such as yourself." Brian bristled at the insult, his fingers tightening on his rifle. Boron noticed the reaction, and his grin widened. "I propose a challenge," the Orion said. "Single combat, you against me. If you win, I will order my troops to withdraw. If I win—" He trailed off, letting the implication hang in the air. Sorensen grabbed Brian's arm. "Don't do it," he hissed. "You can't trust that scaly bastard to keep his word." Brian hesitated, torn. He knew Sorensen was right, but what choice did they have? If the Orions found Reeve and the others before they could get the defenses online, it was all over. He needed to buy more time, even if it meant risking his own life. Boron's eyes glittered with malice. "The central courtyard 1 hour from now. Come alone and unarmed. If I see any of your compatriots, the deal is off." Brian nodded curtly. "I'll be there." The hologram winked out, and Sorensen rounded on him, furious. "Are you out of your goddamn mind? You're going to get yourself killed." "Probably," Brian agreed. "But it's our best shot at keeping the Orions focused on us instead of Reeve. We have to give him as much time as we can." Sorensen looked like he wanted to argue further, but the set of Brian's jaw made it clear his mind was made up. "Fine," he said at last, "but I'm coming with you. I'll stay out of sight, but I'll be damned if I'm going to let you face that scaly fuck alone." Brian clasped his friend's shoulder, gratitude welling in his chest. "Thanks, Sor, I owe you one." An hour later, Brian stood in the center of the courtyard, the noon sun beating down on his head. The ground was littered with rubble and scorch marks, testament to the ferocity of the fighting. He had left his weapons behind as agreed, but he could feel the reassuring weight of the combat knife tucked into his boot. Boron emerged from the shadows of a ruined archway, flanked by a pair of guards. The Orion commander was clad in full battle armor, the black carapace glistening in the harsh light. He carried a wicked-looking plasma glaive, the edges crackling with barely restrained energy. "I see you kept your word, human," Boron said, coming to a stop a few meters away. "I'm almost impressed." Brian shrugged. "I'm a man of my word, unlike some people." With a hiss of pressurized air, the Orion's helmet retracted, revealing his scaled visage. He tossed the glaive aside and cracked his knuckles, talons glinting. "I prefer to do this the old-fashioned way," he said, grinning savagely. "More satisfying to feel your life drain away with my bare hands." Brian said nothing, dropping into a fighting crouch. He beckoned Boron forward with a twitch of his fingers. The Orion lunged, crossing the distance between them in a single bound. Brian twisted aside at the last second, feeling the whoosh of displaced air as Boron's fist passed a hair's breadth from his cheek. He pivoted and drove an elbow into Boron's side, aiming for the gap between the armor plates. The Orion grunted, more in surprise than pain, and lashed out with a vicious backhand. The blow caught Brian across the face, snapping his head back and filling his mouth with the coppery taste of blood. He staggered, shaking his head to clear the stars from his vision. Boron pressed his advantage, hammering at Brian's defenses, with a flurry of punches and kicks. Brian gave ground, dodging and weaving as best he could. He managed to land a few glancing blows of his own, but it was like hitting a brick wall. The Orion's strength was immense, far greater than any human's. Each impact rattled Brian to his core, threatening to shatter bone. Brian feinted left, then dove right, rolling beneath Boron's outstretched arm. He came up behind the Orion and leaped onto his back, wrapping an arm around Boron's throat. The Orion roared, reaching up to grab at Brian's head. Brian hung on grimly, tightening his chokehold. He could feel Boron's pulse hammering beneath his forearm, feel the Orion's struggles growing weaker as he cut off the blood flow to his brain. Boron's hand found purchase on Brian's hair, wrenching his head back. The Orion threw himself backwards, slamming Brian against the ground. The impact drove the breath from his lungs and broke his grip. Boron rolled off him, coughing and sucking in great gulps of air. Brian lay stunned, pain lancing through his chest with every shallow breath. "Get up," he told himself, "get up or you're dead." He pushed himself to his hands and knees, blood dripping from his nose and spattering the dusty ground. Boron loomed over him, triumph etched into every line of his alien face. "Pathetic," the Orion sneered. "Your kind are weak, unfit to rule the stars." He raised his foot, intent on crushing Brian's skull like an overripe fruit. Brian's hand slipped down to his boot, fingers closing around the hilt of his knife. In one fluid motion, he drew the blade and lunged upward, burying it to the hilt in Boron's thigh. The Orion howled, staggering back. Brian ripped the knife free in a spray of viscous green blood, then surged to his feet and rammed his shoulder into Boron's chest. The Orion toppled, Brian on top of him. They grappled across the ground, snarling and clawing at each other like rabid dogs. Brian lost his grip on the knife, heard it skitter away across the flagstones. Boron's hands closed around his throat, claws puncturing skin. Brian gasped, black spots swimming before his eyes. His hand groped blindly for a weapon, anything he could use to break the Orion's grip. His fingers brushed against something smooth and cylindrical, Boron's plasma glaive. Brian seized it, thumbing the activation stud. The blade hissed to life, shedding blinding blue-white light. He swung it up and over in a desperate arc. The glaive sheared through Boron's wrists, severing his hands at the joint. The Orion shrieked, his cry cut off as Brian reversed his swing and took his head from his shoulders. Boron's corpse slumped to the side, ichor pooling around the cauterized stumps of his neck and wrists. Brian lay panting, the glaive falling from his nerveless fingers. It was over, he'd won. In the distance, a deep rumbling built like the awakening of some slumbering beast. Brian pushed himself upright, eyes widening as he saw the obelisk pulsing with eldritch light. Beams of searing energy lanced out from hidden emplacements, scything through the Orion ranks like a scythe through wheat. Reeve had done it. The defense grid was active. Brian threw his head back and laughed, the sound edged with equal parts triumph and exhaustion. They'd bought the time they needed, held the line against all odds. The battle was won, but the war was just beginning. The ground convulsed beneath their feet as the glaive clattered from Brian's grip. Seismic vibrations shook the foundations of the ancient complex, the air filling with a deafening rumble. Boron scrambled back, eyes wide. Turrets burst from the cracked stone walls, swiveling to lock onto the Orion troops. Ancient drones propelled by sputtering thrusters rose from hidden silos, humming with deadly intent. Beams of searing light sliced through the air, vaporizing Orions where they stood. "Fall back!" Boron roared over the chaos. "Back to the ship!" The Orion commander turned and fled, his soldiers close behind. Plasma bolts chased them as they ran, the defense systems merciless in their assault. Brian hauled himself up, head ringing. He staggered over to Boron's headless corpse and retrieved his knife, tucking it back into his boot. The ground pitched beneath him, and he stumbled, catching himself on a crumbling wall. As if to punctuate her words, a massive crack split the courtyard, belching dust and smoke. Brian nodded, wiping blood from his eyes. "Lead the way." They ran, dodging falling debris and gouts of flame as the complex tore itself apart. The air grew thick with choking dust, the din of collapsing stone almost deafening. Reeve took point, his suit's sensors guiding them through the twisting maze of corridors. A section of wall exploded outward, and Ivanov cried out, vanishing in a cascade of rubble. Sorensen lunged for her, but Reeve yanked him back. "No time," the captain shouted over the roar. "Keep moving." Sorensen's face twisted in anguish, but he obeyed, leaping over the pile of shattered stone and pressing on. They sprinted down a long hallway, the floor heaving like a stormy sea. Cracks raced along the walls, widening with each passing second. At the far end, a heavy blast door ground shut, ancient gears shrieking in protest. "Faster," Brian urged, putting on a burst of speed. "We're almost there." They leaped through the narrowing gap, the door slamming shut behind them with a resonant boom. Brian and the others lay panting, lungs searing as they gulped down lungfuls of dusty air. Reeve was the first to rise, crossing to a large viewport set into the far wall. Beyond the reinforced glass stretched an enormous hangar, its domed ceiling crisscrossed with metal support beams. And there, sitting on the cracked ferrocrete like a relic from another age, was a ship. Angular and predatory, it reminded Brian of a great hunting bird, all sweeping wings and razor lines. The hull was pitted and scarred, but appeared intact. Reeve pressed a hand to the glass, eyes distant. "Hello, old friend," he murmured. "Let's see if you've still got some fight in you." The team approached the ship cautiously, awed by the sight of the ancient war machine. Reeve climbed aboard, hands flying over the controls with practiced ease. The engines coughed, sputtered, then roared to life, lifting the craft from its long rest on repulsors. Brian and the others piled into the damaged shuttlecraft, strapping in as Reeve maneuvered the fighter out of the hangar. The ruins crumbled around them, massive blocks of stone plummeting from the ceiling and shattering on the hangar floor. They rocketed out into the open air, the complex collapsing behind them in a maelstrom of fire and debris. Reeve whooped over the comm, the joy of flight evident in his voice. "You're a sight for sore eyes, Valkyrie," he said, patting the console. "Let's show these Orion bastards what a real ship can do." No sooner had the words left his mouth than a plasma bolt sizzled past the canopy, close enough to scorch the transparent steel. Boron's patrol ship rose from behind a nearby ridge, cannons spitting fire. Reeve wrenched the stick, sending the Valkyrie into a spiraling dive. The nimble fighter danced through the air, plasma bolts peppering the ruins around them. In the shuttlecraft, Brian and his team clung to their harnesses, the inertial dampeners straining to compensate for Reeve's wild maneuvers. Choi reached for the salvaged pulse cannon they'd rigged to the shuttle's hardpoint, flicking off the safety. "Get me a target," she said grimly. Reeve juked and wove, trying to shake the patrol ship. The Orion vessel was faster and more heavily armed, but the Valkyrie had the advantage of agility and a pilot who knew every crack and crevice of the ruins. They whipped around a crumbling tower, Reeve cutting the engines and letting momentum carry them into a tight turn. The Orions overshot and Choi opened up with the pulse cannon, stitching a line of glowing holes across the patrol ship's flank. The Orion ship shuddered, smoke pouring from the rents in its hull. It whirled, bringing its guns to bear, but Reeve was already gone, darting behind another shattered spire. "Their shields are down," Sorensen reported, eyes glued to his scanner. "One more good hit should do it." Reeve sent the Valkyrie into a climbing turn, arcing up and over the ruins. The patrol ship pursued doggedly, cannons hammering at their aft shields. "Hang on," Reeve shouted. "This is going to be tight." The Valkyrie dove, straight toward a narrow gap between two leaning towers. Choi tracked the patrol ship, finger tense on the trigger. Reeve cut the engines again, flipping the Valkyrie end for end. For a split second, they hung suspended, nose to nose with the oncoming Orion ship. Choi fired, the pulse cannon tearing through the weakened hull and into the patrol ship's vital systems. The Orion vessel bucked, fire blossoming from its engines. Reeve hit the thrusters and the Valkyrie shot forward, bare meters ahead of the expanding fireball. The shockwave slammed into them like a hammer blow, alarms shrieking as the shields struggled to compensate. And then they were through, afterburners roaring as they clawed for open sky. Behind them, the patrol ship ploughed into the towers, vanishing in a roiling eruption of plasma and debris that scattered the ruins like kindling. Brian sagged back in his seat, head thumping against the headrest. "Nice flying," she shot back, nodding to Reeve. The captain laughed, adrenaline still thrumming through his veins. "Feels good to be back in the saddle." He glanced over his shoulder at Brian. "So, where to now, boss?" Brian looked out at the stars, jaw tightening. Somewhere out there the Orion Empire waited, its fleets poised to descend upon the scattered remnants of humanity. But they weren't beaten yet. They had a ship, a crew, and a cache of data that could change the course of the war. It was a start. "Earth," Brian said. "We have a homecoming to plan." The Orion patrol ship shuddered, a series of explosions rippling across its hull. Brian allowed himself a fleeting moment of satisfaction as Choi's expert gunnery tore into the enemy vessel, but their victory was short-lived. A blinding pulse of energy erupted from the Orion ship, washing over the Valkyrie and the damaged shuttlecraft. Consoles exploded in showers of sparks, the acrid stench of burning circuitry filling the air. The fighters lurched drunkenly, artificial gravity fluctuating wildly. "Emp!" Reeve shouted over the wailing alarms. "All systems are fried. I've lost control." The Valkyrie, trailing smoke, plunged towards the jungle canopy below. Reeve fought with the unresponsive controls, his jaw clenched as he tried to coax some flicker of life from the ship's systems. At the last moment, repulsors sputtered to life, slowing their descent just enough to avoid total catastrophe. The fighter tore through the dense foliage, leaves and branches shattering against the viewport. It hit the ground hard, skidding and bouncing across the uneven terrain before finally slamming to a stop against the gnarled trunk of an enormous tree. He kicked open the jammed canopy, the humid air smacking him like a physical blow. The jungle stretched in all directions, an impenetrable wall of green. Distant screeches and howls echoed through the trees, sending a chill down his spine. This place was dangerous, and not just because of the Orions hunting them. There were things lurking in the shadows, ancient and hungry. He'd have to be careful. Reeve checked his sidearm and grabbed the emergency kit from the Valkyrie's storage compartment. Then, with a last look at his crippled ship, he set off into the jungle, following the distant plume of black smoke rising from the mountains. If Brian and the others were still alive, that's where he'd find them. Miles away, Brian dragged himself from the twisted wreckage of the shuttlecraft, his whole body one giant bruise. Alarms blared, the acrid stench of leaking coolant and burnt insulation heavy in the air. He coughed, wiping blood from his eyes. "Sorensen," he called out, his voice ragged. "Choi, anyone?" A groan answered him, and he staggered around the shuttle's crumpled nose to find Sorensen pinned beneath a spar of buckled metal, his face pale. Brian heaved the debris aside, servos whining in his exosuit. Sorensen shook his head, wincing. "Don't think so. Hurts like hell, though." Choi limped out from behind the shattered remains of the shuttle's engine, one arm hanging awkwardly at her side. Her face was smudged with soot, her hair singed. "Ivanov didn't make it," she said flatly. "Bled out before I could reach her." Brian closed his eyes, grief and anger warring in his chest. Ivanov had been a good soldier, a friend. He'd make sure the Orions paid for her death. "We can't stay here," he said, pushing himself to his feet. "Boron will have search parties out in force. We need to find Reeve and get to those ruins." "Why the ruins?" Sorensen asked, accepting Brian's hand up. "We should head for the extraction point, try to link up with reinforcements." Brian shook his head. "You saw the same data I did. There's something else down there, something big. A warship buried beneath the foundations. If we can reach it before the Orions, it might be our only shot at getting off this rock alive." Choi frowned. "A warship, are you sure?" Sorensen blew out a breath. "That's a hell of a long shot, boss. The Orions will be all over those ruins. Then we'll just have to be sneakier than them, won't we?" Brian hefted his plasma rifle, checking the charge. "Move out and stay alert. There's no telling what's waiting for us out there." As if on cue, a piercing shriek cut through the jungle, something huge and angry crashing through the trees towards them. Brian swung his rifle up, finger tightening on the trigger. Brian's heart hammered against his ribs as he ducked behind a crumbling pillar, plasma bolts sizzling through the air above his head. The narrow entrance to the underground hangar had become a kill zone, choked with the bodies of fallen Orions and slick with dark blood. Reeve crouched beside him, his face grim as he fired controlled bursts from his rifle. "We can't hold them off much longer," he shouted over the din of battle. "We need to get those doors open." Brian nodded, popping up to squeeze off a few shots at the advancing Orions. "Choi, Sorensen, get on it!" A plasma bolt caught Sorensen in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending him crashing to the ground. Choi grabbed him by the collar and dragged him to safety behind a pile of rubble, leaving a smear of blood in their wake. "Charge is set!" Choi yelled, hunched over Sorensen as she applied a pressure bandage to his wound. 30 seconds! Brian and Reeve redoubled their efforts, pouring fire into the Orion ranks. The aliens fell back, taking cover behind the twisted remains of their fallen comrades. "Brian!" Reeve called out, his voice tight with urgency. "I think I can activate the warship's defenses from here, but I need you to buy me some time." Brian gritted his teeth and nodded. "Do it, we'll hold the line." Reeve ducked down, his fingers dancing across the screen of his wrist computer. Brian rose to a half-crouch, sighting down the barrel of his rifle. The Orions surged forward, sensing weakness. Brian's finger tightened on the trigger. A gout of flame erupted from the blast doors as Choi's charge detonated, shredding metal and stone alike. The shockwave sent Brian tumbling, his rifle skittering away across the blood-slicked floor. Through the ringing in his ears, he heard Reeves' triumphant shout, "Defense systems online!" A deep thrumming filled the air, the ancient warship stirring to life deep within the hangar. Laser turrets emerged from hidden emplacements, swiveling to track the Orion forces. Missiles roared from launch tubes, arcing over the battlefield and slamming into the alien ranks with devastating precision. The Orions broke, their advance faltering as the warship's weapons cut through them like a scythe through wheat. Brian staggered to his feet, scooping up his rifle. "Fall back!" he roared. "Get to the ship!" His team needed no further encouragement. They scrambled through the blasted ruins of the blast doors, Choi and Sorensen supporting each other as they limped towards the waiting warship. But the Orions weren't finished yet. As Brian and Reeve brought up the rear, harrying the alien retreat with precise bursts of fire, a new threat emerged from the smoke-filled sky. "Incoming!" Reeve bellowed, his eyes wide. The drones opened fire, plasma cannons and missile pods flashing. The warship's shields flared, absorbing the initial barrage, but Brian knew they wouldn't hold for long. And then the hangar itself shuddered, ancient structural supports cracking and crumbling under the onslaught. Massive chunks of stone and metal began to rain down, smashing against the warship's hull. "The whole place is coming down," Choi screamed, ducking as a boulder the size of a ground car crashed down mere feet away. Brian's mind raced, desperately searching for a solution. They couldn't stay here, but they'd never make it to the warship in time, not with the drones and the collapsing hangar bearing down on them. Unless... "Reeve," he shouted, grabbing the captain by the shoulder. "Can you override the warship's systems, get it moving?" Reeve blinked, then nodded, understanding dawning in his eyes. "I can try, but I'll need direct access to the control interface." "Then go, get the ship in the air." Brian shoved him towards the warship's lowered ramp. "We'll buy you as much time as we can." Reeve hesitated for a split second, then clasped Brian's arm. "Give 'em hell, soldier." He turned and sprinted for the ship, dodging falling debris and plasma bolts alike. Brian watched him go, then turned to face the oncoming swarm, Choi and Sorensen at his side. They formed a line, their rifles spitting defiance into the teeth of the storm. Drones fell from the sky, perforated by plasma and shredded by shrapnel. But more always took their place, an unending tide of metal and malice. Behind them, the warship's engines roared to life, thrusters flaring blue-white. The ramp began to rise, hydraulics whining. "Brian!" Choi screamed, desperation etched across her face. "We have to go!" But Brian stood firm, his rifle blazing. He would not yield, not now, not with their goal so close at hand. They had come too far, lost too much, to fail now. The warship lifted from its cradle, its hull scraping against the crumbling walls of the hangar. Reeve was at the controls, fighting to keep the massive vessel steady as it clawed for altitude. The ramp hung open, a yawning chasm beckoning. Choi and Sorensen broke, dashing for the promise of safety. Brian lay down a final withering salvo, then turned to follow. But too late. A drone, its armor pitted and scorched, slammed into the hangar floor mere meters away. The impact shattered the ancient stone, a spiderweb of cracks spreading out from the point of collision. The floor heaved, then collapsed, swallowing the drone and the Orions alike in a maelstrom of shattered stone and twisting metal. Brian leaped, stretching for the rising ramp, his fingers scrabbling for purchase. For a heart-stopping moment, he hung suspended over the abyss, nothing but air beneath his boots. Then a hand caught his wrist, hauling him up and over the lip of the ramp. Sorensen, his face pale and drawn, clung to Brian with grim determination, even as the hangar disintegrated around them. Together they staggered into the warship's cavernous hold, the ramp slamming shut behind them. The warship shuddered as Reeve pushed the engines to their limit, stone and metal crashing against the hull. Brian and Sorensen stumbled, struggling to keep their footing on the bucking deck. And then, with a final titanic roar, the hangar collapsed completely, burying the remnants of the Orion forces beneath a mountain of rubble. The warship burst from the debris cloud, its armor scorched and pitted, but intact. They had done it. Against all odds, they had seized the ancient Juggernaut's legacy and turned it against their foes. The battle was won. But the war was just beginning. The warship surged forward, smashing through the crumbling ruins. Stone and metal shrieked against the hull, the viewscreen filled with a maelstrom of debris. Brian and the others clung to the bulkheads, the inertial dampeners straining to compensate. With a final wrenching groan, the warship burst free from the hangar, soaring into the smoke-filled sky. Reeve let out a whoop of triumph, the G-forces pressing them back into their seats. "We're not out of this yet," Brian cautioned, his eyes locked on the scanners. "Boron's ship on our 6 and closing fast." "Battle stations," Reeve barked. "Brian, take weapons control. Choi, see if you can coax more power from the engines. Sorensen, damage report." The crew scrambled to obey as the first plasma bolts slammed into their aft shields. The warship shuddered, ancient armor buckling under the onslaught. Brian's fingers danced over the weapons console, the targeting reticle flashing red as it locked onto the Orion patrol ship. He squeezed the trigger, the warship's cannons thundering in response. The patrol ship jinked and wove, Boron's expert piloting on full display. Brian gritted his teeth, trying to anticipate the Orion's moves. The two ships spiraled through the upper atmosphere, weapons flaring, hulls scorched and pitted. "Rerouting power," Choi responded, her fingers flying over her console. "But these systems are ancient. I don't know how much longer they'll hold." His gaze fell on the readout for the warship's experimental jump drive. A crazy idea began to form, a desperate gambit. He turned to Reeve, meeting the captain's gaze. "I have a plan," Brian said, "but you're not going to like it." Reeve's eyes widened as Brian quickly outlined his proposal, to use the jump drive to teleport their ship directly into the Orion hangar, to take the fight to the enemy's heart. It was audacious, reckless, and quite possibly suicidal. Reeve hesitated for only a moment, then nodded grimly. "Do it." Brian turned back to his console, fingers racing over the controls as he powered up the jump drive. The warship groaned, ancient reactors straining to meet the sudden demand. The warship shuddered as another volley of plasma slammed into its shields. Warning lights flashed crimson across the bridge, the acrid stench of burnt circuitry filling the air. "Shields are gone," Sorensen reported, his voice edged with panic. "We can't take another hit like that." "Almost there," Brian muttered, his eyes locked on the jump drive's charge indicator. "Just a few more seconds." Reeve sent the warship into a dizzying spiral, the inertial dampeners struggling to compensate. Boron matched them turn for turn, the two vessels corkscrewing through space, weapons blazing. The jump drive thrummed with power, the deck plates vibrating beneath their feet. Brian's finger hovered over the activation key, his heart pounding in his ears. "Mark!" he shouted. Reeve wrenched the controls, bringing the warship's nose to bear on the Orion patrol ship. For a single crystalline moment, the two vessels hung suspended, mere kilometers apart, weapons locked on each other's hearts. Brian stabbed the key, and the universe turned inside out. The warship vanished in a blinding flash of light, the fabric of space-time twisting and folding around them. For an eternal instant, they hung in the void, suspended between heartbeats. And then, with a wrenching jolt, they rematerialized directly inside the Orion hangar bay. The warship's cannons were already firing as its hull slammed into the patrol ship's superstructure, metal shrieking and tearing like foil. Orion's soldiers scattered, caught off guard by the sudden appearance of the enemy in their midst. Plasma bolts and shrapnel filled the air, the hangar dissolving into chaos. Brian leaped from his seat, rifle in hand, a savage grin splitting his face. "Let's finish this." The warship slammed into the Orion patrol vessel's hangar with bone-shattering force. Metal shrieked and tore, sparks cascaded from ruptured power lines, and the deck heaved beneath Brian's feet. He grabbed hold of a bulkhead to keep from being thrown to the ground. Reeve pushed himself up from the pilot's chair, blood trickling from a gash on his forehead. "Everyone in one piece?" Choi coughed, waving away a cloud of acrid smoke. Still breathing, Captain Sorensen? Reeve nodded grimly. Agreed, we need to find him and end this once and for all. They staggered out of the warship's battered hull and into the patrol vessel's hangar. It was a scene of utter chaos. Orion crew members swarmed like angry ants, some fighting the fires raging out of control, others rallying to repel the boarders. Brian and his team waded into the fray, rifles spitting plasma. They fought their way across the hangar deck, stepping over the bodies of fallen Orions. The air shimmered with heat, the deck plates sticky with blood and hydraulic fluid. A squad of Orion soldiers burst from a side passage, weapons raised. Brian dropped to one knee, sighting down his rifle's barrel. He squeezed the trigger, the recoil slamming into his shoulder. The plasma bolt took the lead Orion in the throat, vaporizing his head in a spray of gore. Reeve charged past him, a salvaged Orion plasma blade flashing in his hand. He moved with the speed and grace of a much younger man, the blade slicing through armor and bone like they were made of paper. Choi and Sorensen brought up the rear, laying down a withering hail of suppressing fire. The Orions fell back, their numbers thinned and their resolve wavering. Brian pushed forward, stepping over the twitching corpses. The command center should be just ahead. Let's move. They raced down the smoke-filled corridors, the ship shuddering around them as secondary explosions tore through its guts. Orion crew members fled before them, their discipline shattered by the ferocity of the humans' attack. And then they were there, the command center doors looming before them. Brian slapped the controls and the doors slid open with a hiss. Boron stood in the center of the room, surrounded by a ring of his elite guard. The Orion commander's eyes blazed with hate and rage. "You dare," he snarled, drawing his plasma blade. "You dare to challenge me on my own ship?" Brian stepped forward, his rifle leveled at Boron's chest. "It's over, Boron. Your ship is crippled. Your crew is in disarray. Surrender now, and I'll grant you a quick death." Boron threw back his head and laughed, a harsh grating sound. "Surrender? To a pack of hairless apes? I think not." He lunged forward, his blade slashing for Brian's throat. Brian parried with his rifle, the weapons clashing in a shower of sparks. They traded blows back and forth across the command center, Boron's guard circling warily, looking for an opening. Reeve and the others engaged the Orions, the confines of the command center, turning the battle into a brutal close-quarters melee. Choi ducked under a guard's swing and buried her knife in his armpit. Sorensen grappled with another, his massive hands wrapped around the Orion's throat. Brian barely noticed, his entire focus on the deadly dance he and Boron weaved. The Orion commander was fast, far faster than any opponent Brian had ever faced. His blade was a blur, striking from a dozen angles at once. But Brian was fast too, and he had desperation on his side. He knew that if he fell here, the human race would fall with him. That knowledge lent him strength, and he pushed himself harder, moving faster than he ever had before. Their blades locked, the plasma fields crackling and spitting. They strained against each other, faces inches apart. "You fight well for a primate," Boron grunted, "but you are still no match for me." Brian snarled and headbutted the Orion, feeling the crunch of cartilage. Boron staggered back, purple blood streaming from his ruined nose. "Reeve!" Brian shouted, not taking his eyes off Boron. "The power core, take it out!" Reeve nodded and sprinted from the room, Choi and Sorensen falling in behind him. They vanished into the smoke-filled corridors, heading for the ship's engineering section. Boron charged again, roaring in wordless fury. Brian met him head-on, their blades clashing in a blinding flare of light. They spun and slashed, parried and thrust, their movements a blur of speed. The ship bucked and shuddered around them, the deck pitching beneath their feet. Somewhere deep in the bowels of the vessel, Reeve and the others had reached the power core. Brian could only pray they succeeded in their mission. He leapt over a console, Boron's blade slicing the air where he'd been a heartbeat before. He rolled to his feet and lashed out, his rifle butt cracking against Boron's jaw. The Orion stumbled, spitting broken teeth. Brian pressed his advantage, hammering at Boron with a flurry of blows. The Orion gave ground, his defense faltering, And then, with a snarl of triumph, Brian knocked the plasma blade from Boron's hand. It clattered to the deck, deactivated. Brian leveled his rifle at the Orion's head, his finger tightening on the trigger. "Yield!" he growled. Boron glared at him, hate smoldering in his eyes. But before he could speak, the ship lurched violently, throwing them both off their feet. A deep, ominous rumble built from somewhere below decks. "That's our cue," Brian said, staggering upright. "Reeve did it. The power core is going critical." He turned and ran, leaving Boron sprawled on the deck. He sprinted through the corridors, the ship coming apart around him. Bulkheads buckled, pipes burst, and electrical fires raged out of control. He reached the hangar just as Reeve and the others emerged from a side passage, their faces streaked with soot and sweat. "We have to go now," Reeve shouted over the din of tearing metal. "This whole ship is about to blow." They scrambled aboard the warship, sealing the hatches behind them. Brian threw himself into the co-pilot's seat as Reeve frantically worked the controls. The warship shuddered, the metal groaning as it strained against the patrol ship's hull. Reeve gritted his teeth, pouring every ounce of power into the engines. With a screech of rending steel, the warship tore free, the inertial compensators straining to handle the sudden acceleration. They rocketed away from the dying Orion vessel, the jump drive's field enveloping them. And then, in a blinding flash of light, the patrol ship detonated. The explosion was titanic, a miniature sun blooming in the void. The shockwave slammed into the warship like a hammer blow, sending it tumbling end over end. Brian clung to his harness, his teeth rattling in his skull. He watched the roiling fireball recede on the viewscreen, the debris from the destroyed Orion ship glinting in the fiery light. It was over. They had won. Against all odds, they had struck a blow against the Orion Empire that would be felt across the galaxy. But as the adrenaline faded, and the pain of his injuries began to make themselves known, Brian knew their fight was far from finished. Boron was dead, but the Orion Empire remained, vast and powerful and hungry for vengeance. They would be coming for them now, coming for the stolen warship and the knowledge locked within its ancient databanks, coming to erase the stain upon their honor. Let them come, Brian thought, a grim smile tugging at his lips. We'll be ready for them. The battered warship limped through space, the light of distant stars reflecting off its pitted hull. In the cockpit, Brian slumped in his seat, exhaustion pressing down on him like a leaden weight. His muscles burned, his bones ached, and his skin was scorched and bruised. Reeve sat beside him, his face drawn and haggard. Blood crusted his uniform where he'd torn strips of cloth to bind his wounds. Choi and Sorensen were in the rear compartment, tending to their own injuries with the warship's meager medical supplies. Brian glanced over at Reeve, meeting the older man's eyes. "What now, Captain?" Reeve sighed, leaning back in his chair. "Now? Now we find a quiet little corner of the galaxy to lick our wounds and plan our next move." He gestured to the nav computer, its screen filled with scrolling star charts and flickering coordinates. "The data we pulled from the ruins on that jungle world is our ace in the hole. If we can get it back to the Resistance, it could change the course of the war." Brian nodded, wincing as the movement pulled at the burns on his neck. "The Orions won't make it easy. They'll be hunting us now with everything they've got." "Let them hunt," Reeve said, a hard edge to his voice. "We'll be the ones setting the traps from here on out." He reached out and clasped Brian's shoulder, his grip firm. "You did good back there, soldier, damned good. I couldn't have asked for a better crew at my side." Brian returned the clasp, a fierce pride burning in his chest. "We're with you to the end, Captain. To the end and beyond." He turned back to the controls, his fingers dancing across the console. The warship's engines thrummed with power, the stars blurring into streaks of light as they accelerated into the void. Brian stared out the viewport, his thoughts racing. They had struck a mighty blow against the Orions, but he knew it was only the beginning. The road ahead would be long and hard, filled with danger and sacrifice. But he was ready for it, ready to fight and bleed and die for the chance to see humanity rise again, to see the Orion Empire crumble to dust beneath the boots of free men and women. The future was unwritten, a blank page waiting to be filled. And with fire and blood and unyielding will, they would write their names upon the stars. The warship shuddered, its hull groaning under the strain of the battle damage. Brian gripped the armrests of the command chair, his knuckles white as he stared at the flickering displays. The jump drive was a ruined, molten slag, the weapon systems depleted to nothing more than empty racks and smoking barrels. Even life support wheezed on its last legs, the air growing thin and stale. Reeve stumbled to Brian's side, his face ashen, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The centuries of stasis, combined with the brutal combat, had taken their toll. He sagged against the console, blood seeping through the makeshift bandages wrapped around his torso. "Brian," Reeve rasped, his voice barely above a whisper. "There's something you need to know, something I've kept hidden even from the crew." Brian leaned closer, his brow furrowed. "What is it, Captain?" Reeve coughed, flecks of blood spattering his lips. "The ship. It carries an experimental AI, the sum total of the Juggernaut's knowledge and technology. It was our greatest secret, our most powerful weapon." Brian's eyes widened, the implications hitting him like a hammer blow. With that kind of power at his fingertips, he could change the course of the war, maybe even the fate of the galaxy itself. Reeve seemed to read his thoughts, his hand shooting out to grab Brian's wrist in a vice-like grip. "Listen to me," he hissed, his eyes burning with intensity. "This power, it's too much for any one person to wield, too much for any one species. I've seen what it can do, the destruction it can cause." He sucked in a shuddering breath, his grip tightening. "Promise me, Brian, promise me you won't let it fall into the wrong hands. Use it wisely or not at all. The choice is yours, but the consequences will be on your head." Brian swallowed hard, the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a lead cloak. He nodded slowly, meeting Reeve's gaze. "I promise, Captain. I'll do what's right. What you would have done." Reeve smiled, a thin, bloody thing. "I know you will, son, I know you will." His eyes fluttered closed, his chest stilling as his final breath escaped in a soft sigh. Brian bowed his head, grief and anger warring in his heart. Reeve had been more than a captain, more than a mentor. He'd been a friend, a brother in arms. And now he was gone, another casualty in the endless war against the Orions. A soft chime echoed through the bridge, drawing Brian's attention. He looked up, his eyes widening as a holographic figure materialized in the center of the room. It was Reeve, or rather, a perfect replica of him, right down to the battle-scarred armor and the fierce, determined set of his jaw. "Greetings, Commander," the AI said, its voice a perfect match for Reeve's. "I am the autonomous intellect, the repository of the Juggernaut's knowledge and power. How may I assist you?" Brian stared at the hologram, his mind racing. With the AI at his command, he could turn the tide of the war, crush the Orions beneath his heel, and lead humanity to a new golden age. He could be a conqueror, a ruler, a god among men. But Reeve's words echoed in his mind, a warning and a plea. The power of the AI was too great, too dangerous. It had to be contained, controlled, or else it would consume everything in its path, leaving only ashes and ruin in its wake. Brian closed his eyes, his decision made. He would honor Reeve's memory, honor the sacrifices of the Juggernaut's crew. He would do what was right, even if it meant giving up the power he'd always dreamed of. "Activate self-destruct sequence," he said, his voice steady. "Erase all data, all knowledge, all technology. Leave no trace of the Juggernaut's legacy." The AI paused, its holographic face flickering with confusion. "Commander, are you certain? This action cannot be undone. The power of the Juggernaut will be lost forever." Brian nodded, his jaw set. "I'm certain. It's what Reeve would have wanted. It's what needs to be done." The AI inclined its head, a gesture of respect and acceptance. "Very well, Commander. Initiating self-destruct sequence. You have 5 minutes to evacuate the ship." Brian turned to his team, his eyes hard. "You heard the AI. Grab what gear you can and get to the escape pods. We're abandoning ship." They scrambled to obey, snatching up weapons and supplies as they raced for the pods. Brian lingered for a moment, his hand resting on Reeves' still chest. "Thank you, Captain," he whispered, "for everything." Then he was gone, sprinting down the corridors as the ship shuddered and groaned around him. He dove into the last escape pod just as the timer hit 0, the hatch slamming shut behind him. The warship exploded in a brilliant flash of light, a miniature sun blooming in the void. Debris peppered the pod's hull, the shockwave sending it tumbling end over end. Brian clung to his harness, his teeth gritted as he rode out the turbulence. And then it was over, the silence of space rushing in to fill the void left by the warship's destruction. Brian stared out the viewport, watching the glittering remnants of the Juggernaut's legacy drift away into the darkness. It was a bittersweet victory, a hollow triumph. They had defeated Boron, destroyed the Orion patrol ship and the ancient warship alike. But the cost had been high, the sacrifices immense. Reeve was gone, the AI erased, the power of the Juggernaut lost forever. But perhaps that was for the best. Perhaps some power was too great for any one species to wield, too dangerous to be left unchecked. The Juggernaut had been a marvel, a testament to the ingenuity and determination of the human spirit. But it had also been a warning, a reminder of the destructive potential of unchecked ambition. As the escape pod drifted through the void, Brian leaned back in his seat, his eyes closed. The legend of the Juggernaut would live on, a story told in hushed whispers and awed tones, a tale of sacrifice and heroism, of the high cost of power and the unbreakable will of the human spirit. And he would be a part of that legend, a footnote in the annals of history, the man who had found the Juggernaut, who had unleashed its power and then sealed it away forever, the man who had made the hard choice, the right choice. Brian smiled, a small sad thing. The future was uncertain, the path ahead fraught with danger and hardship, but he would face it head-on, with the same determination and courage that had carried him this far. For he was human, and the human spirit could never be broken, never be conquered. It would endure as it always had, as it always would, and he would be there to lead the way, to forge a new path among the stars. The legend of the Juggernaut would echo through the ages, a testament to the indomitable will of humanity, and Brian would be its herald, its champion, its guardian, now and forever, until the stars themselves burned out and the universe faded to black. The debris field stretched out before them, a graveyard of twisted metal and shattered dreams. Brian stared out the shuttle's viewport, his eyes hollow, his heart heavy with the weight of all they had lost. Reeve, the warship, the AI, all gone, sacrificed in the name of keeping humanity's legacy out of Orion hands. Beside him, Choi piloted the shuttle, her face grim as she navigated the treacherous field. Sorensen sat in the rear, tending to the wounds they'd sustained in their desperate escape. Suddenly a shadow fell across the shuttle, blocking out the starlight. Brian looked up, his blood running cold as he saw the massive Orion dreadnought looming above them, its hull bristling with weapons. "Incoming transmission," Choi said, her voice tight. "It's on all frequencies." The comm crackled to life, and a holographic image flickered into existence before them. A scarred Orion face, twisted with rage and malice, glared down at them. "Admiral Zorgax," Brian breathed, recognition dawning. Boron's superior, the mastermind behind the Orion's relentless pursuit. "Human filth," Zorgax spat, his voice dripping with contempt. "You have something that belongs to me. The AI, the knowledge of your precious Juggernaut. Surrender it now, and I may grant you a swift death." Brian's fists clenched, his jaw tightening. He knew what Zorgax would do with that power, the subjugation of humanity, the enslavement of countless worlds. He couldn't let that happen, not after everything they'd sacrificed. Brian met Zorgax's gaze, his eyes hard as flint. "I'd rather die than betray my people to the likes of you." Zorgax's face contorted with rage, his scarred visage twisting into a mask of pure hatred. "Then die you shall, human. You and all your pathetic kind." The transmission cut out, and the dreadnaught's weapons began to glow, charging up for a lethal barrage. Brian turned to his team, his expression grim. "Get to the escape pods," he ordered, his voice brooking no argument. "Evacuate the shuttle. I'll buy you as much time as I can." Choi shook her head, her eyes wide. "Brian, no, we can't leave you." "That's an order, soldier," Brian snapped, his tone softening as he saw the anguish on her face. "Please, I need you to live, to carry on the fight. The galaxy needs you." Sorensen clasped Brian's shoulder, his grip firm. "It's been an honor, boss. Give 'em hell." Brian nodded, watching as his team reluctantly filed into the escape pods. He turned back to the controls, his hands flying over the console as he disengaged the safety protocols and rerouted power to the thrusters. The shuttle lurched forward, accelerating towards the Dreadnought's bridge. Zorgax's eyes widened as he realized Brian's intentions, and he barked orders to his crew, desperate to stop the suicidal charge. But it was too late. The shuttle, laden with the last of its explosives, slammed into the command center, detonating in a blinding flash of light and shrapnel. The explosion tore through the Orion vessel, ripping through decks and bulkheads like paper. In the escape pods, Brian's team watched in horror as the Dreadnought listed, its engines sputtering, its weapons falling silent. The shuttle was gone, consumed in the fiery blaze, along with their leader and friend. Choi bowed her head, tears streaming down her face. Sorensen clenched his fists, his knuckles white with grief and rage. They had won, but at a terrible cost. As the pods drifted through the void, awaiting rescue from Earth's forces, the team mourned the loss of Brian and Reeve, two heroes who had given everything to keep humanity's legacy out of enemy hands. Their sacrifice would not be forgotten, their legends spreading across the stars, inspiring all those who yearned for freedom from Orion tyranny. But even as the embers of the once mighty warship cooled, whispers echoed through the galaxy, whispers of other ancient relics waiting to be discovered, of the indomitable human spirit that refused to be extinguished. The fight was far from over, and the legacy of the Juggernaut would live on, a beacon of hope in the darkness of space. You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.